Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to speak to you all. I can't promise that I'm going to explain what exactly happens after the palace burns and all that, but if you can ask, I suppose, in the end. But I'm not going to talk about my poetry. I'm going to talk about some other poetry more important than mine, of which you have some examples that I offered. So I won't be able to have time to actually read the poems, but I hope that you will have had a chance to take a look, or will take a look here after my talk. So today I will discuss poetry from a philosophical perspective and focus on a single question, its relation to truth. The understanding of this relation bears a number of implications for the role poetry may play in our contemplation of the world and on ourselves as knowers of that world. I do not aim to defend a single notion of truth here, but want to indicate what might be the value of seeking truth in multiple ways. For indeed, at the heart of philosophical discussions of poetry is its relation to truth, and this is meant in several senses. Advocates and serious readers of poetry may be struck by what they regard as a poem's inherent truth, even when a poem expresses little that corresponds in any precise way to reality, and where its content is resistant to paraphrase. The discovery of likenesses among ostensibly dissimilar things, as expressed often in metaphor and simile, the rendering of distinctive and profound thought, the evocation of experiences that are at once novel and yet deeply familiar, the giving of voice to genuine or perhaps sincere and therefore unarticulated and theretofore unarticulated emotion may play their role in the experience of poetry as a kind of conveyance of truth. Yet philosophers have been divided on the subject of poetry from Plato to the present. Some have associated poetry and literature more broadly with illusion, with falsity, and even with lies, while others have affirmed poetry's truth value as a kind of truth par excellence. At issue, however, is not whether poetry can relay any truth at all, for even its harshest critics tend to admit that it can, but rather whether truthfulness is intrinsic to successful poetry, and whether there is a mode of truthfulness that is distinctly poetic, manifest through poetic language in distinction from other modes of language. By the way, I have to say that I mean poetry here in a rather broad sense, because I'm going to refer all the way back to the ancient Greek discussion of poetry, which would be lyric, epic, and tragedy, for example, all the way up to modern poems, mostly lyrical poems, although most of my conversation will have to do with modern poetry. Perhaps the most prominent argument for a distinctly poetic truth arises from phenomenological hermeneutics, namely that poetry enacts a form of revealing, a disclosure of the world, a capacity enabled by poetry's productive defamiliarization of language. In this view, the disclosive nature of poetry consists in its making appear or opening a view onto the world or our experience of it in ways thought to be inaccessible by ordinary language, with its epistemic habits, its cognitive shortcuts, and its inherited conventions. The very strangeness of language prompted by poetic form, its use of metaphor and imagery, for example, enables an idiosyncratic cognitive and emotive orientation toward a poem's given subject matter that is said to reveal it in a novel way. Poetry may thus give rise to thought that may not be readily evoked through practical uses of language, yet may genuinely and perhaps beneficially impact a reader's view of the world or of their own place in it. The merits of this view of poetry as revealing, discussed for the most part in the second half of my talk, will be here considered against the backdrop of the historical debate about poetry in Western philosophy, which will be very familiar to some of you, though perhaps not all, which I'll discuss in the first half. I hope to trace a tension between poetry's reproductive relationship to reality and its productive generation of images and ideas. While the model of poetic revealing will be shown to advance beyond this historical debate, it may inadvertently reiterate an unexplored tension between poetry as reflection or reception of reality and poetry as a creation of the mind. For the model of poetry as truthful revealing may sustain an unwarranted poetic realism, that reality is simply depicted by poetry that gets it right, thus neglecting the generative and transformative capacities of poetry to render reality according to a distinctive perspective, or even to diverge wildly from the real. While some poems may be said to reveal the world or some part of it, others may illuminate precisely the provisional nature of some of our accounts of reality, may generate new thoughts and ways of thinking that contrast to the world as it as it is or as it appears to us. Theodor Adorno argued that the illusory nature of poetry, rather than disqualifying any and all relation to truth, is related to its unique, what he called its unique truth content. At the same time, the imaginative element of poetry need not be dismissed as merely illusory if it responds to, and thus throws into relief, what the American poet Wallace Stevens called the pressure of reality in its dominant manifestation. A different kind of exposure, a truth of imagination, could be attributed to poetry that, as Seamus Heaney argued, offers what he called a redress to reality. In what sense that can still be considered truth will need to be considered, of course. In order to situate contemporary models of poetic truth, we may first turn to the historical and philosophical context. For the diverging views of Plato and Aristotle on the subject of poetry set the terms for the debate about poetry that continues into the present. Here we can identify a tension between poetry's capacity to represent or reflect reality on the one hand, and to transform experience and create new thoughts, images, and ideas on the other. This tension will have significance for our assessment of the notion of poetic revealing in the second part of the discussion, excuse me, as well as for the cognitive relevance of poetry, both at its evidence and exercise of imaginative thinking. Elaborating in the Republic upon what he refers to as poetry's ancient quarrel with philosophy, Plato establishes central tenets of poetic theory for much of the tradition to come. Plato's proposal for the censorship of poets in the education of his ideal polis is wide-ranging, psychological and moral, political, metaphysical, and epistemic. It concerns both the content of poetry and its style of expression. No poetic utterances, he writes, should be allowed that are neither holy nor advantageous to us, nor in harmony with one another. Plato is especially critical of tragedy as overstimulating emotion, promoting lamentation over and fear of catastrophe and death. Homer's epic poetry is also frequently criticized in Plato's discussion, not only in the Republic, where Homer is accused, of course, of misrepresenting the gods, but also in Ion, where Homer's exponent, and by implication the poet himself, are shown to lack knowledge of the matters depicted in his poetry. It is concluded there that truth that happens to be conveyed by the poet arises not from art, but as inspired. Poetry is defined in the Republic according to the principle of mimesis. Representation, or sometimes translated as imitation. For Aristotle, too, poetry is the representation of action and of life. This definition of poetry as mimesis persists in views of literature through the end of the 20th century. For example, with Erich Auerbach's monumental treatment of literary mimesis as the representation of reality, Kendall Walton's treatment of make-believe as the foundation of literature and all the representational arts. John Searle's description of fiction as comprised of a pretended assertion seems to identify a similar principle at the level of the statement. Even Martha Nussbaum's affirmation of poetic justice, or literature as enabling moral attunement and acquaintance with the perspectives of those different from ourselves, relies upon its realistic representation of the depicted experiences. More recently, it has been argued that the discovery of the neurological basis of imitation, or mimesis, in mirror neurons reveals the origin of literature. For Plato, of course, mimesis has the connotation of imitation, whether in the sense of copying in literary poetic images or of impersonation, where a poet or actor speaks in the voice of another as if he or she were that character. The derivative nature of these activities brings poetry into conflict with truth, for they give no guarantee of true likeness to the subject matter represented. Plato repeatedly draws the analogy of literary language with images made by a painter. Both deal, and only derivatively, with appearances of things as perceived by the senses rather than with their essences as known by reason. Just as a picture can look like its object with greater or lesser fidelity to its appearance, what is represented in words can be appropriately presented or distorted. Moreover, any image, literary or otherwise, is inherently distortive because it is merely the representation of an appearance, not the imitation of reality as it is, but of appearance as it appears, says Socrates. Poetic representations, equivalently distortive and derivative, are likened to lies, and insidiously so, since such mimesis through language and rhythm is held to reach the inward places of the soul. For Plato, the poet is a producer of a product 3 removes from truth. These criticisms of poetry have been repeated almost verbatim by philosophers of recent years. associating poetry with deception, untruth, unregulated emotion, falsity, obstruction of understanding, ignorance, error, moral irresponsibility, and mental illness. Even as of 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. But there was another way of approaching the matter, of course, starting with Aristotle. As we know, Aristotle is more generous to poetry and allows for a more nuanced concept of mimesis as its first principle. Like Plato, Aristotle characterizes poetry according to its medium, style, and objects that are represented or imitated. However, Aristotle's treatment differs from that of Plato in two ways. Firstly, Aristotle regards mimesis as the foundational fact of human life and learning. Imitation is innate, or as Aristotle puts it, rooted in nature. Aristotle argues that we enjoy mimesis for its cognitive stimulation, noting elsewhere that human beings enjoy the exercise of our natural cognitive capacities. We enjoy the referential nature of images and like to compare the representation of the object to what it is meant to represent. We enjoy the likeness. Yet even in the case of the mimesis of an object of which we have no model, for example, something which we happen not to have seen the original, we enjoy this too, Aristotle says, for its skill of execution. Thus it is not likeness alone which we value, but the production itself of a compelling representation of possibility. For Aristotle's account allows for a revaluation of mimesis by recognizing that poetry does not merely represent or reflect actual things and events, but constructs representations of possible ones, those that could happen or could be, or ought to happen or ought to be. Where Plato allows only for faithful or distorting representations, Aristotle considers poetic mimesis a medium of thought about the possible and its presentation. With this account, Aristotle sets the parameters for defenses of poetry's value, as argued, for example, by Horace, Sir Philip Sidney, Thomas Hobbes, and so forth. With the rise of aesthetics in the 18th century, poetry, of course, became a candidate for truth in its own right. Kant, for instance, in the Critique of Judgment, affirms poetry as the highest of the arts because it is capable of expressing aesthetic ideas. Yet by privileging poetry, Kant seems to introduce an apparent paradox, since, as he describes, by an aesthetic idea, I understand that representation of the imagination which occasions much thought, without any definite thought, i.e. any concept, being capable of being adequate to it. It consequently cannot be compassed and made intelligible by language. Poetry's very medium is language. It is the highest of the arts for its expression of aesthetic ideas, yet aesthetic ideas themselves are said to be resistant to expression in language, at least as conceptual expression. Yet if we consider poetry to involve a different use of language than ordinary language, this paradox is at least softened if not overcome. Kant allows for the suggestion that poetic language may present aesthetic ideas while not conceptually determining, or as Kant would put it, legislating the thought it occasions. Words in poems, as Wittgenstein pointed out, must mean what they do in ordinary language. However, these meanings need not be fixed exclusively to the literal, but may endow further figurative and metaphorical meaning. Kant claims of aesthetic ideas that they arouse more thought than can be expressed in a concept determined by words. For Kant, this allows poetry to reflect the freedom of the aesthetic subject, who experiences what he calls a free play of the imagination in concert with the understanding. But it also leads us to consider poetry as a use of language that diverges in some ways from ordinary conceptualization. Poetical language, of course, relies on, but also frustrates, linguistic generalizations by preserving the specificity and irreducibility of experiences they evoke. That's a positive way of putting it. Of course, someone who doesn't like poetry would just say it frustrates clarity. The image that gives sensibility to an idea becomes, in poetry, inexhaustibly significant and evocative. Kant's view of poetry inspires not only Coleridge, but the German Romantics, who identify poetry somewhat mystifyingly, in Novalis' terms, with the true and absolute reality. In a text attributed to the young Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, some debate about who actually wrote it, it is declared that poetic art alone will outlive all the rest of the sciences and arts. Like that of the Romantics, Nietzsche's affirmation of the poetic echoes Kant's view of poetry, but must be seen in light of his discussion of ordinary language, which, he argues, denies the unique and wholly individual experience to which it owes its birth. We obtain the concept, he argues, as we do the form, by overlooking what is individual and actual in experience. Poetry, by departing from ordinary expectations of language, using expressive metaphor and imagery and other means of invoking specificity, may allow for the expression of thoughts that displace the cognitive assumptions of ordinary language. Poetry can also destabilize the presumptions supported by grammar. If Descartes, as Nietzsche argues, relies upon grammatical habit in offering his view of cogito ergo sum, poets may diverge from this. So a few examples. D.H. Lawrence writes in a poem, not I, but the wind that blows through me," in reference to the source of his thoughts. And in a similar spirit, and in defiance of grammar, Rimbaud writes, "Je est un autre," which in English is something like, "I is an other." So it's as if they'd read Nietzsche and said, okay, well, let's give a counter-grammatical assertion that would destabilize the idea of the self. Where poetry may challenge even the first principle of modern philosophy, it is dealing, at least, in truth, and here indeed exposing the potential illusoriness of the stable self-identical subject a century before such claims are debated by cognitive scientists as they are now. So, turning to the second part of my talk. Poetry is the revealing or founding of truth and the poetic imagination. The distinction between poetic language and ordinary language becomes central to accounts of poetry in the phenomenological and hermeneutic tradition emerging in the 20th century. Poetry is held to evoke an experience of reality that may enable us to grasp both world and language in a more primal way than our intellectual abstractions and the narrowing of calculative rationality may have allowed. Metaphor, for example, at once departs from usual classifications and, by novel renderings of likeness, may elicit a recognition of connections among apparently unrelated objects, for instance, human beings and other things of nature. Thus, the poet Richard Wilbur claims that it is a fundamental impulse of poetry, he says, to refresh the aspect of things. In this context, truth is conceived not as a faithful reproduction of reality or the adequate fit between an idea and its referent, but as an original event of revealing, which Heidegger, mentioned earlier today, describes as unconcealment, as bringing to appearance from a former state of hiddenness. Forms of art, especially poetry, which are held to engage such revealing, are regarded as affording a more original access to things, or more generally, as he says, to being. This notion of revealing also appears in Sartre's affirmation of literature, in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological aesthetics, and in Gadamer's hermeneutics. Of course, poetic revealing may not necessarily expose the world objectively without reference to human concerns. While Heidegger sometimes treats the poet as a sort of vessel of being who avoids anthropocentric points of view, much of the poetry Heidegger actually interprets, from Hölderlin's river poetry to Rilke's elegies, ponders precisely the human and even personal relationship to nature. In his essay on the contribution of poetry to the search for truth, Gadamer largely adopts Heidegger's notion of poetry as revelatory truth, set within a hermeneutic account of language as a form of dialogue. Poetic language, in addressing the things of the world, forms a kind of answer to the implicit question of their familiarity. Language makes the world familiar to us, makes us at home in it. Yet while in ordinary experience, in our ordinary use of language, we do not reflect on this, or on the proximity and nearness of things, a successful poem, he thinks, brings its subject matter near to the reader in a certain way. It allows the transient nearness of things a stay in our consideration, in our memory. It renders presence to fleetingness. The strangeness of language in poetry makes us aware of this nearness, and thereby bears witness to our own being. This idea is echoed in Roger Scruton's recent affirmation along Heideggerian lines of the notion of poetic revealing. But while Heidegger and Gadamer think that it is the world or being which is revealed, Scruton identifies the object of revelation to be human consciousness itself. The truths revealed by art, he claims, are truths about us, about the archaeology of consciousness. Yet Scruton further proposes a kind of truth as value, one which comes to inhere in things, endowed to them through the poetic act. This involves the view Scruton thinks originates in Rilke, that the meaning of things is bestowed on them by poetry through the act of saying them. We can draw an example of such revealing from Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Moose. in which the speaker recounts a bus journey toward Boston through rural Nova Scotia. The landscape is initially described in the light of the setting sun, and these passages I'm going to point out are just very small little bits of a much larger poem that you have on your handout. Where silted red, sometimes the sun sets facing a red sea, and others veins the flats lavender, rich mud in burning rivulets, on red gravelly roads, down rows of sugar maples, past clapboard farmhouses and neat clapboard churches, bleached, ridged as clamshells, past twin silver birches. This sort of lush, rhythmic description of the landscape, largely recalled by the speaker over several stanzas, follows the light of the setting sun as it moves over the horizon and casts its red glow on places and things both natural and human-made. The reverie is eventually interrupted as we are brought to the present perception. The bus starts, the light grows richer, the fog, shifting, salty, thin, comes closing in. With this stanza, the tone shifts. As the bus sets out for the journey, the richer light introduces a transformed perception, as fog envelops the scene and induces a heightened awareness of nature's proximity. The rhyme of thin and in the above stanza, contracting the reader's attention. The speaker goes on to describe the fog settling on the flowers and fences, details the stops along the way, fields, animals, and the rural inhabitants of the countryside as seen from the window, while intimate conversations in the bus are overheard. The lulling daydream is evoked by the flow of contemplation over many stanzas from one object to another. Then the bus stops suddenly, for a moose has come out of the impenetrable wood and stands there, looms rather, in the middle of the road. It approaches, it sniffs at the bus's hot hood, towering, antlerless, high as a church, homely as a house, or safe as houses, and it goes on. The sighting of this moose provokes wonder, a brief suspension of ordinary experience, giving the passengers, the narrator goes on to say, this sweet sensation of joy. The central object of the poem, what it reveals, is not so much the animal per se. We don't learn anything about what a moose is really like, exactly, but a momentary contact between human beings in their modern mechanical transport and the remote and wild, the speaker says, impenetrable nature they traverse. The animal is rendered in human scale. It is immense, and yet identified metaphorically, first through the verb towering, with architectural structures, compared also to a church and to a house and its safe shelter. Not through any literal description, but through this metaphorical likening, the moose is familiarized for the humans who encounter it, and the particularities of the image complex evoke a rare moment of union between the otherworldly and the domestic, the strange and the familiar, the transcendent and the immanent. The final olfactory image at the poem's end of the lingering smell of moose and acrid smell of gasoline returns the speaker to earthly materiality. But the juxtaposition of those two scents leaves the reader to question whether any transcendence sensed in the encounter can be wholly rooted in an ordinary view or valuing of the world. The overall effect of the poem is felt as this lingering and unresolved question. There is little question that, I think, from the speaker's position, the value of the human encounter with the wild moose is lyrically suggested. But any conclusion to be drawn from it is left implicit and thus open to interpretation. If poetry has a revelatory truth value, this does not give us clear determinations of the nature of reality, yet an encounter is generated and lingered over, and its value emerges in the light of a potential relationship, approachable only as experience from the point of view of the experiencer. The question of perception and of getting things right, also related to truth, is the subject of Frost's poem, For Once Then Something, of which here I have just an extract. Here what is described in the poem is ostensibly just an object of visual perception, something glimpsed at the bottom of a well, but the very unclarity or uncertainty of the object, for, as the speaker says, water came to rebuke the too clear water, generates other thoughts. The situation is this. The speaker describes having peered into a well, and instead of lingering over his own reflection as usual, he notices something else, and his perspective is shifted. Once, when trying with chin against a well curb, I discerned, as I thought, beyond the picture, through the picture, a something white, uncertain, something more of the depths, and then I lost it. water came to rebuke the too clear water. One drop fell from a fern, and lo, a ripple shook whatever it was lay there at bottom, blotted it out. What was that whiteness? Truth? A pebble of quartz? For once, then, something. Frost's speaker is clear that what is at stake is not merely the surety of perception, but a possible truth discerned for a moment beyond the picture. If this picture is not just the literal reflection in the water, but stands metaphorically for the way the world appears to us in general, then to see beyond and through it is to have an insight beyond what ordinary perception typically encourages. But it is important that at a literal level, the picture beyond which the speaker momentarily sees is a picture of himself, or herself, reflected in the water. This literal reflection of the self can stand for a habitual way of regarding reality through the lens of self-orientation, through a human and perhaps egocentric perspective. Only when the speaker gets beyond seeing his own reflection in things, it is implied, does he encounter something, uncertain as it is, that is more of the depths. Frost's poem, in its final two lines, then poses two alternatives. That something glimpsed may have been truth, something immaterial, or just the physical effect of a pebble lying at the bottom of the well. The final phrase, for once then something, settles on neither option, allowing the reader to linger in the question and the wonder it provokes. The reader is exposed to the consideration of a truth that lies beyond and behind appearances, yet with no reassurances of its status. Frost's poem does not involve truth as assertion, but as an event of genuine questioning. Any knowledge involved in such poetry is not a matter of possession, but of seeking. The ambiguity, uncertainty, or provisionality of poetic revealing, however, may be at odds with some aspects of this theory of poetry by Heidegger we had referred to earlier, perhaps the most well-known model in the post-Kantian philosophical tradition. For in the origin of the work of art, poetic revealing is not merely described as receptive, a linguistic exposure of beings or of being itself. For there, Heidegger makes the further claim that poetic revealing founds or institutes truth. Promoting his favorite poets, such as Hölderlin and Rilke, Heidegger argues that the nature of art is poetry, the nature of poetry, then, is the founding of truth. I could say a lot more about what this actually means, but in deference to time, I just want to draw out the fact that this aspect of Heidegger's theory may be problematic, quite apart from whether the privilege that he, like Kant, grants to linguistic over other arts is justified. Heidegger renders poetic language as the expression of being itself, both rejecting the view of poetry as derivative of reality, as Plato had espoused, and arguably overlooking poetry's relation to imagined possibility, as emphasized by Aristotle. Against Heidegger, Adorno points out that what a given poem says in a literal sense is often contradicted by its other moments and by its formal disjointures. The truth content emerges for Adorno not as the founding of a world by the poem, but as the result of the totality of moments in the poem itself, which, unlike philosophical systems, does not yield any synthesis or finalization of meaning. The uncertain meaning of the coupling of the smell of mousse and gasoline in Bishop's poem, and the unresolved question about perception at the end of Frost's poem could illustrate this as well as one of Hölderlin's poems, to which Adorno attends, Hälfte des Lebens, or Halves of Life, in which images of bountiful summer in the first stanza are sharply juxtaposed without mediation to those of lonely winter abandonment in the second stanza. While Heidegger tends to collapse the distinction between poetry and the truth it could be said to found, Adorno insists on the aesthetic quality of the work of art, by which he means that it is a semblance, that it is illusory. Every interpretation of poetry, he writes, that formulates it as Aussage, some sort of message or statement, violates poetry's mode of truth by violating its illusory character. In Adorno's view, the alignment of poetry with founding or even revealing reality, as Heidegger and Gadamer aim to do, neutralizes the critical capacity of poetry to expose reality by its very difference from it, to present the possible over and against the actual. In this inversion of Plato's assessment, the very truth of poetry is not denied but affirmed by its illusory character. Yet Adorno's solution, to place the critical value of poetry solely in its illusory character, or indeed to characterize poetry principally as illusory, may also be unsatisfying. for this aesthetic approach may fail to recognize that poetry's yield for the reader, I would argue, emerges through the tensions between revealing and invention, between exposure and creation, and that poetry's revelations can have implications for real human life and self-understanding. We may consider these lines from another poem by Frost, After Apple Picking, which describe the speaker's estranged perception of the world as seen through the sheet of ice on a day when he spent picking apples from a very tall ladder in a tree. The perceptual defamiliarization the speaker describes could reflect worldly experience, but also gives way to poetic perception or imagining captured in the notion of a form of dreaming. So, drawing from the middle section of this poem, roughly, the speaker says, I cannot rub the strangeness from my sight I got from looking through a pane of glass I skimmed this morning from the drinking trough and held against the world of hoary grass. It melted, and I let it fall and break. But I was well upon my way to sleep before it fell, and what I could tell what form my dreaming was about to take. Here the speaker describes a present disorientation, attributed this to having gazed that morning at the world through a sheet of ice that had formed on the water in the drinking trough. The speaker designates the ice a pane of glass that induced a strange perception of the surrounding field and orchard, the metaphor likening the natural phenomenon of ice to a human-made object oriented for light and vision, and highlighting the problem of human perception. It melted, and I let it fall and break. That line ought to have signaled the end of the effect of that induced perception. But the next lines, in abrupt rhythmic alteration between double iambs and full iambic pentameter, introduce the dreaming induced by that defamiliarization. The speaker claims knowledge of the form of that dreaming, which I would suggest is the imaginative generation that gives rise not only to dreams of sleeping, but to poetic thought and indeed to poem writing. The strangeness of alternative seeing lasts long beyond the perceptual provocation described, and here the poet does not merely linger over it, but productively describes images of apples magnified, and this is, you'll have to refer to the longer poem, images of apples magnified that appear and disappear, and reflects on the trouble of apples not falling, lest they, in touching the ground, become of no worth. That's the main concern, that the apples will fall and become bruised. Indeed, the speaker's heaven-bound ladder is said at the poem's outset to be still pointing upward as it rests against a tree, while at the poem's end, the speaker's concern is earthly, considering whether the sleep coming on will be like the impending winter sleep of an animal hibernating or like a human sleep. The whole metaphoric situation of the poem, then, does not only reveal, but constructs a world, one which the speaker's consciousness somewhat precariously suspends between the poles of at least a metaphorical heaven and earth, ripening and falling, wakefulness and dream. It is in this sense comparable to Rilke's famous elegies, in which the angelic consciousness repeatedly evoked demarcates a region for poetic contemplation between earthly, imminent human experience and a transcendent beyond we can only imagine. The metaphor creates a mode of poetic reference which is neither equivalent to reality nor merely illusion. We could draw, for example, on Ricoeur's argument about metaphor, wherein the suspension of literal reference is the condition for the release of a power of the second-degree reference, which is properly poetic reference. The effort of apple picking in the poem, unfinished and now implicitly questioned by the reader, by the speaker, for he is overtired of the harvest I myself desired, he says, may stand for human toil and striving as such. Thus, while the world of the poem, as a poetic construction, could be said to be illusory, its truth content or poetic reference also involves and reveals indirectly, in a rather resounding implication, the encompassing reality of human endeavor. In this poetry, revealing is tentative and evocative rather than founding and determining, and yet, I would suggest, rather than being merely or solely illusory, may generate critical and exploratory reflection on reality and the human place in it. Such generative revealing, I would suggest, is not likely to result from poetry that relies on mere sentimentality or on stale metaphors that fail to reorient our cognitive attention. In order to reveal, poetry would have to, I think, evoke connections that prompt thought and feeling in new ways. Let's see. In order to reveal, poetry must evoke connections that prompt thought and feeling in new directions and in new ways, and may be related to the truth as an event, insofar as it opens up a consideration of meaning, and perhaps of life in general. In this respect, we can also point to another of Rilke's works in his famous poem, Archaische Torso Apollos, or Archaic Torso of Apollo, which is very well known, and you probably know it. The ending of that poem, Du musst dein Leben ändern, or You must change your life, prompts self-reflective speculation on the part of the reader, almost as the poem is structured, which I don't have time to describe now, but I'm happy to talk about later, almost inevitably so, whether or not the life that is thereby put into question is indeed challenged or changed. But revealing alone may be insufficient to account for the variability and scope of poetry's relationship to truth. For apart from the provisionality of poetic revealing mentioned above, we might also consider the imaginative content of poetry and its various ways of generating new thoughts that cannot be taken for reflections on or representations of reality alone. And here again we go back to Ricoeur, who argues that metaphor can generate new meaning that is irreducible to the meanings of the terms it compares. Through such means, poetry describes, but also invents. Poetry elaborates and furthers experiences not only of observation, but of imagination. Shakespeare's Sonnet 43, for example, that starts, "When I most wink, then do mine eyes best see," describes the speaker's relation to an absent beloved through dream. But the sonnet also, maybe, implicitly articulates the poet's and reader's relation to the content of poetry itself through imagining, via consciousness that is not, like mundane everyday perception, unrespected. Not only in sleep, but in poetry, imagination, diverging from present perception and assumption, allows human thoughts to be, as Shakespeare writes, bright and dark directed. As this imaginative propulsion of thought, poetry does not only reveal, but creates experience. To name another example, the speaker of Coleridge's Kubla Khan undertakes an imagined journey to the 13th century Mongolian emperor's summer palace, in which we find the lines, "A savage place, as holy and enchanted as ere beneath a waning moon was haunted." A place which neither the poet nor any possible reader could experience in reality, and which may be criticized as a product of merely imaginary topography. Perhaps more locally, but equally generative, Rilke offers these lines as an Orphic invitation to imagining in his sonnets. These are also on your handout. "Singe die Gärten, mein Herz, die du nicht kennst, wie in Glas eingegossene Gärten, klar unerreichbar." Or, "Sing the gardens, my heart, that you do not know, like gardens poured in glass, clear, unreachable." Such imagining obviously exceeds a revealing to relation to the world already there. We can't pour gardens into a glass. By engaging the possibility of an imagined world, a world we do not yet and cannot maybe know in reality. Here Aristotle's emphasis on the capacity of poetry to engage possibility comes to mind, for it is the possible and the possibly imagined that both undermines Plato's rejection of poetry as mere distortion and complicates the idea that poetry is true because it reveals reality as it is. The tension between revelation and invention of world, here's some of the examples that I have drawn of poetry that may be thought in ways that are merely imaginary. The tension between revelation and invention of world is thematically explored in the poetry of Wallace Stevens. Stevens renders both explicit and ambiguous the problem of reality, or the relationship between poetic language and the reality it would represent or describe. In Bouquet of Roses and Sunlight, for example, we are invited by the speaker to undertake a metaphysical speculation. Within this poem we read, "Say that it is a crude effect of black reds, pink yellows, orange whites, too much as they are to be anything else in the sunlight of the room, too much as they are to be changed by metaphor to actual, things that in being real make any imaginings of them lesser things." The speaker here suggests that real things like these flowers and even perhaps their colors may seem to be too much as they are, too actual to be susceptible to change by metaphor and imagination. Despite the focus on color, which of course would vary in the sunlight, Stephen's speaker seems to recognize the solidity of reality, its resistance to imaginative intervention. In the next breath, however, that reliable actuality, the sense that the world as real is independent of our perspective on it, is itself challenged as the speaker continues. And yet this effect, he says, is the consequence of the way we feel and therefore is not real except in our sense of it. So I think what he's saying is we have a sense of reality. Whatever revealing is enacted by this poetry is not an exposure of being or reality as such, but of the human relation to reality, of the perspective we take to things. The last stanza makes, which is not up here, makes the human perspective indeed the focus of attention. We are two that use these roses as we are in seeing them. And I love that. We are two that use these roses as we are in seeing them. Who are the two? Maybe reader and speaker, perhaps. In other poems, which I won't have time to describe in any detail, Stevens explores the power of imagination not only to expose reality as vulnerable to imagination, but also to create new kinds of objects of thought through imaginative intervention. In 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, we get multiple renderings of an object of thought as transformed by metaphor, in the poet's presentation of 13 different scenes anchored by the image of a blackbird. Here, poetry exposes the conventional fixation of language that, in Nietzsche's critique of cognitive sedimentation, would associate an image with a single static and univocal signification. Considering these ways of looking, we may think of poetry in one way as the promotion of multiplicity and even inexhaustibility in our interpretations, not only of linguistic images, but of the world from which they are drawn. The ways of looking playfully promoted by Stevens' poem seem to resist any overarching conceptual assimilation, resisting poetry's exclusive assignment to truth in any traditional sense. We do not have to follow a plot, a trajectory of narrative, or anything like a realistic vision of experience to engage this poem. If there is any truth to be revealed, it concerns language as play and provocation on the part of an imagining, perceiving, and feeling subject. Such poetry unsettles our linguistic uniformities, not to undo them, but to reveal them as convention, and to refresh our attention to alternatives. Yet, as Simon Blackburn has recently argued, a poetic sensitivity to those uniformities, or even the ability to bend and transcend them, is unquestionably our best guide to who we are, even to where we ought to be heading. I'm not sure he's right that it's unquestionably the best guide to who we are, but I think it is a guide to who we are. So in conclusion, poetry admits a long and contested relationship with the notion of truth, as we have seen in this discussion of poetics, from Plato to the phenomenological and hermeneutic model of the 20th century. Yet I have suggested here how poetry may be involved with truth in just a few ways. The idea of poetic revealing offers an alternative to the reduction of poetry to a merely distorting representation of the world, even as poetry defamiliarizes both language and the world it describes. We can find a form of truth in poetry's evocation of reality as encounter, revealing the human and often particular perspective that shapes its appearance and value for us. The often provisional, questioning, and imaginative status of poetry, however, should trouble claims for a poetic founding or instituting of truth. Since poetry both reveals and creates, both reflects the actual and engages possibility, poetry may generate renderings of alternatives to the real that by their very divergence have implications for reality, in part by relativizing a given manifestation or interpretation of it. As such, poetry offers provocation and sustenance for critical and reflective thought. The exercise of crucial cognitive power of imagining, however indirect, is a contribution to truth in its own right. Thank you.